A people with no cavalry, no war chariots, no bronze armor, no trained battle formation. On the other side, the most sophisticated military machine the ancient world had ever seen. Hundreds of horse-drawn chariots, mounted archers, armored infantry, and the full authority of a pharaoh who considered himself a living god on earth. If you look at that confrontation purely by the numbers, by the conventional logic of any battlefield in the second millennium BC, the outcome was already written before the first move. Israel would be crushed. There would be no narrative. There would be no exodus. There would only be silence. And yet, that is not what happened. This is the central paradox we are going to break apart today. Because the story of Moses standing against Pharaoh is not just a story of faith, it is one of the most tactically intelligent campaigns the Bible records, executed under pressure that most commanders in antiquity would never have survived long enough to describe. And when you start seeing the military logic behind each decision, the route selection, the terrain positioning, the timing of the crossing, what looks like a desperate escape begins to reveal an entirely different architecture. The two central figures of this confrontation are named clearly from the very beginning of Exodus. Moses, on one side, leader of a crowd of Hebrew clans that had just emerged from decades of forced labor in Egypt, with no formal military equipment, no cavalry, no shock units. On the other side, Pharaoh, whose army was the cutting edge of Egyptian imperial power, organized into divisions that carried the names of the gods themselves: Rameses, Ptah, Seth, Amun. Each division with roughly 5,000 men, each with its own infantry, its own archers, its own war chariots. As we read in Exodus chapter 14 verses 6 and 7, Pharaoh took 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. 600 elite chariots. That was not a patrol force. That was a full offensive. Moses knew that, and he knew that any direct confrontation on open desert ground would be fatal. So he did something no pursued army should do according to conventional logic. Instead of fleeing by the fastest, shortest, most direct road away from Egypt, he led Israel toward a route that looked like a dead end. The sea ahead, the desert on both sides, and Pharaoh's army closing in from behind. As we read in Exodus chapter 14 verses 11 and 12, the people cried out, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" Moses had not taken the wrong road. He had chosen that road with precision. To understand why that choice was brilliant, you first need to understand what was coming behind Israel. The Egyptian New Kingdom army was not just large, it was technologically superior to virtually everything else in that world. Every element of its arsenal had been refined over generations, sharpened in campaigns against the Hittites in Syria, against the Nubians in the south, against the Libyans in the west. The Egyptian war chariot was the heart of their battle doctrine, and it was a remarkable piece of military engineering for its time. Lightweight, built with curved wood and tensioned leather flooring to absorb terrain shock, with thin spoked wheels, and a rear-shifted axle for high-speed stability. Each chariot was pulled by 2 horses trained specifically for combat. The crew was 2 men, a driver who controlled the horses and held a shield to protect both of them, and an archer or spearman who operated the weapon. In open, flat ground, it was virtually unstoppable against disorganized troops. The infantry that accompanied the chariots was no less formidable. Egyptian soldiers of the New Kingdom carried large wooden shields covered in animal hide. Their spears had forged bronze tips, far more resistant than stone or bone points still common in other regions. Egyptian archers operated the composite bow, one of the most advanced weapons of their time, built in layers of wood, horn, and animal tendon, capable of launching arrows at distances a simple wooden bow could never reach. The effective range of a composite bow archer could exceed 180 meters. Beyond that, the Egyptians also used the Khopesh, a curved sickle-shaped sword derived from Syrian designs and refined by Egyptian smiths. Devastating in close combat, capable of hooking around an opponent's shield. Elite soldiers and charioteers also wore bronze-scale armor, small overlapping plates sewn onto fabric, offering protection that simple leather could not. Now place that army on open ground, flat, dry, free horizon in every direction. The chariots build speed. The archers reach maximum range. The infantry advances shield to shield. An unarmed crowd, without equivalent weapons, covers perhaps a few hundred meters before being completely overwhelmed. This was exactly the kind of confrontation that army had been built to win. And Moses knew it, so he did not go to that field. If you want to keep understanding how biblical battles reveal a tactical intelligence that few people study seriously, stay with this channel, because we go deep into every one of these stories. The route Moses chose ran along the coastal strip, a narrow tongue of land between the Mediterranean and the inland salt lagoons. That corridor was tight enough to make chariot maneuver extremely difficult. In open ground, 600 chariots could fan out sideways, flank, sweep, surround. In a narrow corridor, with wet sand and unstable soil near the water, those same 600 chariots became a long, vulnerable column with no room to maneuver. The terrain that looked like a trap was actually the only geographic configuration that neutralized Pharaoh's greatest weapon. As written in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 18, "Make war with wise counsel." Moses executed that principle long before it was written down. But terrain alone was not enough. A well-chosen route limits the enemy's mobility. It does not destroy the enemy. For that, the Egyptian army needed to advance with complete confidence into the trap. And this is where the visual perception of the situation worked entirely in Israel's favor. Put yourself for a moment in the perspective of the Egyptian commanders. They watch Israel moving toward the sea. They see the narrow corridor. They see the water ahead. From the point of view of any experienced general in that context, that crowd had just cornered itself. No flanking maneuver was needed. No division of forces. Just push hard from behind and collect Israel against the coast. It was a clean pursuit operation. Exactly the kind of mission Egyptian chariots had been designed to complete. The confidence of the pursuers was total, and that confidence was fatal. Because what the Egyptians did not account for, and what Moses had calculated, was what the terrain would do to the chariots after Israel had crossed. As Exodus chapter 14, verse 25 records, the chariot wheels were jammed, and the Egyptians drove with difficulty. Wheels that lose traction in wet, unstable ground. The same passage that Israel had crossed on foot, with far less weight, now worked against bronze-armored war machines. The mobility that was Egypt's greatest advantage evaporated at the most critical moment of the pursuit. The timing here matters deeply. The crossing happened under the protection of a strong east wind that, as Exodus chapter 14 verse 21 describes, blew all that night and held the path open. Israel crossed in darkness, a night maneuver that moved them out of direct sight of the pursuers and placed them on the other side before dawn revealed what had occurred. When the Egyptians entered the corridor in the growing morning light, conditions were already shifting beneath them, and there was no longer an efficient way to pull back. The very certainty that had drawn them forward, the conviction that Israel was trapped, now kept them advancing when it was already too late to recognize what was happening under the chariot wheels. As Exodus chapter 14, verse 27 records, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its full force. The waters covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them survived. What remained after the waters receded was a lesson no Egyptian military manual had anticipated. The best-equipped army of its time had been destroyed, not by a superior army, not by a rival chariot force, not by more advanced technology. It had been destroyed by a precise reading of terrain, by the exact timing of the crossing, and by the deliberate exploitation of the enemy's own confidence. Every strength of the Egyptian arsenal had been neutralized, not by an equivalent opposing force, but by the intelligent choice of ground. The chariots were invincible on dry, open terrain. They were not invincible on waterlogged coastal sand. The infantry was devastating in compact formation. It was not devastating inside a narrow corridor where there was no room to spread out. The composite bow archers could reach 180 meters. They could not hit targets, who had already crossed to the other side while the horses struggled to stay stable in the mud. The Bible also records that Moses had organized Israel before the Exodus into a functioning chain of command, leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s, leaders of 10s, as Exodus chapter 18 verse 25 describes. That is not administrative detail. That is operational command structure. A people that moves with command structure, even without conventional weapons, can execute maneuvers that a disorganized crowd never could. A night crossing of a coastal corridor with hundreds of thousands of people and livestock required real coordination. And that coordination was possible because Moses had already built the structure that made it viable. The victory of Moses over Pharaoh was, from a biblical standpoint, a victory that came from God. Exodus leaves no doubt about that. But the Bible also records that God worked through concrete tactical choices: the route, the wind, the timing, the terrain. Proverbs chapter 21 verse 31 would say centuries later what the Exodus battle had already demonstrated in practice. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but victory belongs to the Lord. Every horse, every chariot, every bronze spear, all of it was on Egypt's side. It was not enough. Picture that moment. The sun rising on the eastern horizon, the first light falling across the coastal corridor. On the far side, Israel is already out. On the near side, 600 war chariots are trying to reverse course on ground that can no longer hold their weight. Horses sinking, wheels locking, commanders shouting orders that the terrain simply can no longer obey. That image, Pharaoh's war machine paralyzed in the very corridor that had seemed like a trap for Israel, is the tactical and theological summary of everything Moses had built. The teaching that was imprinted not just in the memory of the people, but in the tradition of every Israelite commander who would come after. Terrain chosen with wisdom is more powerful than any armor forged in bronze. Timing executed with precision is worth more than 600 chariots in open ground. And victory belongs to the one who understands the enemy's limitations better than the enemy understands them itself. As written in Exodus chapter 15 verse 3, in one of the oldest military songs the Bible preserves, "The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name."